Before I start, I'd like you to know that the story I'm about to tell is part of a collaboration I'm doing with Proper Horror Show, where we compare the movie Wolf Creek to its real-life counterpart. If you haven't already, I've linked her channel in the description so you can go there to subscribe. I'll be promoting our conversation via my community page, as well as placing a pinned comment here when this is uploaded on her channel, so stay tuned. Thank you, and let's begin. On the 25th of January 1990, 24-year-old British backpacker Paul Onions was leaving Sydney and travelling to Mildura to search for work, in order to continue to fund his Australian adventure. Strapped for cash, he opted to hitchhike his way there. Eventually, a white Toyota Landcruiser would pull up to the young Brit, and he would be offered a ride by a man with a handlebar moustache named Bill. Little did Paul know, but his decision to accept the lift would change his life irreversibly, connecting him to 7 people who also accepted a ride from Bill.
Hello, and welcome to the channel.
Climbing into the Toyota Landcruiser, Paul was extremely grateful to Bill for stopping to give him a lift. Initially, he considered Bill friendly, and the two had begun to engage in small talk. Paul's initial assessment of Bill would quickly change after he began making racist, sexist, and xenophobic statements. Outside of Mittagong, and about 1 kilometre away from Belanglo State Forest, Bill pulled over, telling Paul he wanted to grab a cassette from the boot of the motor, despite there already being a collection of cassettes sprawled about. Bill pulled over, got out, opened the boot, and retrieved something that wasn't a cassette. To Paul's horror, he had returned with a revolver and rope. Bill told Paul that he was being robbed, but Paul, who had spent 5 years in the Navy, instantly kicked into survival mode, and as quickly as he could, he unbuckled his seatbelt, jumped out of the vehicle, and made a dash for it. Running for his life down the Hume Highway, Paul heard shots firing at him as he tried to flag down anyone who could help him get away. Eventually, one driver did. Joanne Berry was driving her sister and 5 grandchildren when she saw a frantic Paul Onions run towards her car. He pleaded to Joanne, "Help me, he's got a gun." Berry quickly let Paul squeeze into her car and sped away to safety. They would make their way to a nearby police station, and both Berry and Onions would file a report. However, police were unable to track down either the vehicle or the man driving it. Paul Onions would return to England soon after his awful experience, with it understandably scarring him permanently. It would be years later, while reading a newspaper article, that Paul would learn how close to death he actually was. More than 2 years after Paul Onions' ordeal, on the 19th of September 1992, 2 people were orienteering through Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. Deep into the woods, they noticed a foul stench in the air. Believing it to be a rotting animal like a kangaroo, they would go deeper into the woods to investigate. They continued to search, following their noses to pinpoint the location of whatever was responsible for the terrible odour. Eventually they would find it. It wasn't an animal. The pair rushed out of the forest and alerted police, who cordoned off the area that same night and began to investigate. What the two had stumbled upon was a concealed corpse of a young woman. By morning, police would find the body of another woman, less than 100 feet away from where the 2 people had found the initial one. The 2 women were identified as being Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22. Both were British women who were backpacking through Australia. Prior to their discovery, they had last been seen on the 18th of April 1992 at King's Cross Hostel, Sydney. During the search for the girls, police took an unorthodox approach to raising awareness by interrupting an England versus Australia rugby television broadcast while the match was being played, in the hopes it would bring maximum attention to the search. The manner of their deaths was extremely brutal. Joanne had been gagged by her attacker, who then stabbed the helpless young woman 14 times, 4 to the chest, once to her neck, and 9 times in the back, severing her spine in the process, leaving her paralysed. It's believed that she was paralysed throughout her attack, as there were no defensive wounds present. As for Caroline, she was shot 10 times in the head, with police believing that the killer had used her for target practice. One of the girls' underwear was missing, and there was evidence of sexual assault on both women. It was clear from what investigators saw that whoever was responsible didn't do this quickly. Cigarette butts were found all over the crime scene, showing that the killer, or killers, had chain smoked throughout the attack. Bullet casings were also found, and nothing of value had been taken from either woman. Both bodies were lying in a north-south direction, with their heads to the south, which caused some concern that there may have been a ritualistic element involved. Police carried out further searches in the forest over the next 7 days, looking for any more clues that could shed more light on the investigation, and possibly more bodies, but nothing of note would be found. As time went on, no further clues were located, and police struggled to find answers to who killed Caroline and Joanne. Resources were now being pulled away from the case for other investigations. But on the 5th of October 1993, over a year since the 2 female backpackers were found, authorities would again find themselves back at Belanglo State Forest. When Bruce Pryor, a local man of the area, was out searching for firewood in a remote section of the forest, he found what could be initially thought of as an animal bone. But Bruce quickly realised he was looking at a human thigh bone. He would also find a human skull, confirming the worst. When Caroline and Joanne's bodies were found, there were fears that a serial killer may be operating in the area, but police weren't convinced of this and attempted to quell these fears. With the discovery of what would turn out to be 2 more bodies, it was pretty evident that there was little police could say to allay the concerns of the public anymore. The victims were identified as being Deborah Everest and James Gibson, both 19 years of age. The couple, who were from Victoria, Australia, were last seen leaving a backpackers hostel near Sydney on the 30th of December 1989, as they were hoping to attend Confest, an annual bush campout festival being held near Albury at the time. The day after they were last seen, a walker found James's camera, which was now broken, on the roadside at Galston Gorge, north of Sydney. However, it would be a month before he reported his finding to the police, after seeing news that James's backpack had been found nearby where he'd found the camera. Now almost 4 years later, both James and Deborah were found approximately 18 miles apart from James's personal belongings. While pathologists were unable to determine the exact cause of death, when it came to Deborah, there was evidence that she'd been hit in the head with a sharp object, and multiple stab wounds were found on her head and body. It was also apparent that she had been bound with her own tights, and that her bra and pants had been cut off using a knife. James was found just 50 metres from Deborah. His body had been covered with sticks and branches, likely to speed up decomposition. Like Deborah, he had sustained several stab wounds to the lungs, heart and liver. Both had been paralysed via a knife wound across the spine, likely to prevent a struggle. This was evidenced again by no defensive wounds being found on either victim. Bullet casings were also found nearby, and as with the killing of Joanne and Caroline, James and Deborah too had met an extremely violent end. With there now being no doubt in the minds of both the public and police that a serial killer was at large, Special Task Force Air was set up on the 12th of October 1993 and was headed by Superintendent Clive Small. In the beginning, 20 officers were assigned to the team, accompanied by crime scene specialists and forensic experts. Sniffer dogs from Queensland were also brought in to scour Belanglo State Forest 3 days later, as Clive Small suspected that there may be other victims in the forest. As time went on, a further 60 officers were brought in to conduct a meticulous 5 square kilometre search in the area where all 4 victims had been found. On the 1st of November 1993, police would find the skeletal remains of 20-year-old German backpacker Simone Schmidl. Simone had been missing since the 20th of January 1991, after she had decided to hitchhike to Melbourne against the advice of her friends. She had made plans to reunite with her mother, but unfortunately she never got to see her. Examinations on her remains bore the same pattern of injuries as the other victims. Clothing was found at the scene, but worryingly, this didn't belong to Simone. Naturally, police assumed that more victims were waiting to be found. After discovering Simone's body, police added another 80 officers to the search of Belanglo State Forest and widened the area of the search from 5 square kilometres to 20. 3 days later, on the 4th of November, police would find 2 more bodies in a shallow grave on a nearby fire trail. Anna Habschied, 20, and Gabor Neugebauer, 21, were 2 German backpackers who had last been seen at King's Cross Hostel, Sydney, on Boxing Day 1991. They had planned to hitchhike out of town to travel to Adelaide. While the same pattern of attack was found, such as multiple stab wounds and binding of the victims, there were significant differences this time. Gabor had been found with a gag wedged between his teeth, and he had sustained 6 gunshot wounds to the head. There was also evidence that he had been strangled beforehand. Anya, however, had her head removed with a sword-like object. Based on how she was found, Dr. Peter Bradhurst, the pathologist who carried out the autopsies on all of the victims, stated the blow she sustained was consistent with her in a kneeling position, with her head bowed, meaning she was still alive when her head was removed. Despite an extensive search of the area, Anya's head has never been recovered. Suspicions that the killings carried a ritualistic nature were also touted after the latest discovery, and Dr. Bradhurst said that based on the information available to him, he speculated that it was more than likely that the murders were not caused by a lone killer. With very little to go on, a cash reward had been set up for information leading to the capture of the killer or killers. But given the pile of bodies building up, by the 5th, New South Wales Police increased this to a staggering $500,000 Australian dollars. Full pardons were offered to accomplices not involved if they would be prepared to give up a name. A tip line had also been opened, which generated 5,100 calls in the first 24 hours, and 1 million tips overall. Police managed to follow up on just 10,000 of these. It was safe to say that they were overwhelmed by the response, partly due to the huge reward on offer. One of those leads came from none other than Paul Onions himself. By now the investigation had become a global concern, and after Paul became aware of the investigation through the British media, he couldn't help but feel his experience was connected to what was happening out there. On the 13th of November 1993, he contacted the police in Australia and gave them his account of the events 3 years prior. He also provided authorities with a detailed description of his attacker, and this information was all logged and placed into the pile of other tips and leads that came through before. Remarkably, his statement wasn't treated more urgently, and it would take a further 5 months for it to come up again. Despite this, police were closing in on a suspect prior to Onion's statement. Using a computer system known as NetMap, they applied link analysis technology to vehicle records, gun licensing, internal police records, and even gym memberships to whittle down their list of suspects from 230 to just 32. One of the names that appeared on the remaining list was Ivan Robert Marco Milat. Interestingly, Ivan's brother, Alex Milat, informed police that around 18 months prior, he witnessed 2 women tied up in the back of 2 cars with a group of men in Belanglo State Forest. His statement was reviewed, but eventually dismissed after inconsistencies were found with the dates and details of his account of events. A man who Alex said he was with at the time was also spoken to, but he was unable to corroborate Alex's account. Although later investigations showed that he had provided 2 partial registration numbers, which when combined matched one of Ivan's vehicles. Alex had always maintained he was telling the truth, right up until his death in June 2017. Another Milat name popped up again when a report was discovered from the wife of a worker at a building materials plant. In her statement, she told police of suspicions that her husband had regarding one of his colleagues, Paul Miller. He had allegedly said to colleagues that there were more bodies out there, and even said he knew about the German victims before they had been discovered. The interesting thing about Paul Miller is that his real name was in fact Richard Milat, an alias which police knew of already. With the Milat name appearing several times now, they decided to take a look into the whole family in more detail. Police would make discreet inquiries with employers to compare holiday and absence leave records with the dates each victim had gone missing. Ivan was the only Milat who had not been to work on any of the days. The evidence was beginning to mount, but it was still flimsy at best. That was until police finally got to reviewing Paul Onions' statement. On the 2nd of May 1994, Paul Onions was flown to Australia in secret, and he took them to the place where the attempted robbery happened. He then took part in a video lineup where he positively identified Ivan Milat as the man he knew at the time only as Bill. Conversations with Ivan Milat's ex-wife Karen revealed that he would often take trips into the Belanglo State Forest, stretching as far back as the 1980s. Police continued to speak with family members of Ivan in order to gather as much evidence as possible to build a solid case. One of these conversations took place with Alex Milat and his wife Joan on the 21st of May 1994. 3 task force air officers spoke with Alex to recount the story he had earlier told police. As he was doing so, Joan handed them a backpack, saying Ivan had given it to them after a friend from New Zealand had moved and no longer needed it. She had also made comments about serial killers keeping trophies, which left the officers both suspicious and unsettled. These feelings would later be confirmed as justified, as the backpack Joan gave them was tested and it was revealed that it belonged to Simone Schmidl.
A 50-year-old man is being questioned tonight in Sydney about the backpacker murders. He was arrested in a huge overnight operation in the Campbelltown area, and since then he's been charged with threatening a hitchhiker in 1990. The arrest led to a new search of the Belanglo State Forest near Bowral.
Heavily guarded, the former truck driver was sped back to Campbelltown Police Station. There, detectives from the Backpacker Murder Task Force began questioning him. Neighbours were stunned by the morning's raid.
They had the next door neighbour out on the ground, had a shotgun to his head.
Others described the arrested man as quiet and gentle.
They kept pretty much to themselves, you know.
Chief of the Murder Task Force, Superintendent Clive Small, also inspected the house.
Now, I've got no comment on any aspect of the operation at this stage.
Late today, the arrested man was charged over threatening a British hitchhiker with a gun at Berrima in 1990.
On the 22nd of May 1994, police had surrounded Ivan Milat's home at 6:36 a.m. They called the house phone and announced themselves to him, hoping that he would come out and surrender. Ivan initially believed this to be a prank by one of his brothers, but when they called back and spoke with his girlfriend at the time, Chalinda Hughes, she informed him that it was in fact genuine. He was arrested without incident for armed robbery and using a revolver with intent to commit an indictable offence involving Paul Onions. Given his close ties to his siblings, searches were also carried out at several of his brother's homes, where more evidence linking him to the murders was found. These included ammunition matching that found at the crime scenes, electrical tape, a manual for a Ruger that used the same rounds as those found at the crime scene. Parts of a dismantled Ruger were found sprawled within Ivan's home. Personal items belonging to the victims were also found, including a water bottle, sleeping bags, and a camera. More items including a tent and bedroll belonging to Caroline Clark, another of Simone's backpacks, and t-shirts belonging to both Simone and Paul were also found. As news of Ivan's arrest quickly spread, many were curious to learn about the kind of man that Ivan was. Police in particular needed to know if they were to understand how such a monster could carry out such vicious attacks right under their noses. Born on the 27th of December 1944, Ivan was the fourth born of 14 children to Croatian immigrant Stepan and his Australian wife Margaret. Despite growing up in a disciplinarian atmosphere, of the 10 boys Stepan and Margaret brought into the world, 7 of them would regularly get into trouble. Ivan would be one of them. In 1962, at age 17, Ivan would spend 6 months in a juvenile institution after breaking into a home and stealing. He would spend the rest of that decade in prison another 4 times for similar crimes, as well as car theft. Ivan's first experience with death came in 1969, when his brother Wally and sister Margaret were involved in a head-on collision near their family home. Reports state that Ivan was first on the scene, and Wally, who was driving, would survive the crash, but sadly Margaret would die in the arms of Ivan. When he was older, Ivan met a woman named Karen, and the pair married in the 1980s. But by Valentine's Day 1987, Karen had left Ivan while he was at work. Reportedly, he had been violent towards her. And in 1989, the couple had finalised their divorce, and within months, Deborah Everest and James Gibson went missing. Ivan Milat didn't drink or smoke, but he had a fascination with guns and hunting. He worked on and off for the Roads and Traffic Authority for approximately 20 years at the time of his arrest. He also had a thing for women, particularly if they were with his own brothers, with Ivan having affairs with Wally's partner, Maureen, and Boris's wife, Marilyn. Marilyn actually had a child with Ivan, a daughter, Lenice, who recently died on the 21st of May 2022. During the latter stages of the investigation, police also discovered that in 1971, Ivan Milat had been charged with the abduction of 2 women and sexual assault of one of them. As they looked into this further, they found that the manner of the attack bore a striking resemblance to that of other victims. However, these charges were later dropped. Ivan Milat entered no plea on the 23rd of May 1994 on the robbery and weapons charges. A week later, he was charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers. His trial would begin in March 1996 and would last 4 months. During the trial, his defence would attempt to point the finger at his brothers Wally and Richard, and that despite the wealth of evidence, none of it could be linked back to Ivan. But a jury would determine otherwise and find him guilty on all 7 counts of murder, as well as attempted murder, robbery, and the false imprisonment of Paul Onions. He received 6 years for each charge relating to Paul, and consecutive life sentences for each of his murder victims. Ivan Milat was beaten on his very first day in jail, and he'd also made a failed attempt to escape from prison around a year later. All attempts to appeal his convictions were quashed, leaving his fate sealed. He resorted to injuring himself, such as in 2009 where he cut his own finger off with a knife, with the intention of posting the severed digit to the High Court. There were also reports that he swallowed razor blades, staples, and various other metal objects. He also went on a 9-day hunger strike in a bid to get a Sony PlayStation. In May 2019, Ivan was diagnosed with esophageal cancer and taken to the Prince of Wales Hospital to undergo treatment. Police were keen to speak with him for one final time, to attempt to convince him to finally confess his crimes, as well as reveal whether there were any other murders he committed. Ivan decided to feign falling asleep throughout the interview and said nothing. He died on the 27th of October 2019 from esophageal and stomach cancer. Over the years, it's been widely speculated that Ivan Milat didn't act alone when carrying out the backpacker murders. The judge residing over his trial, David Hunt, even said in his closing statements, quote, "In my view, it is inevitable that the prisoner was not alone in that criminal enterprise." Many believe that Richard and Wally may have been accomplices, but both vehemently deny any involvement. That being said, they provided alibis for Ivan on the days specific backpackers went missing, with Wally's own wife even amending dates in their family photo album to make it appear as though Ivan was with them around Easter time 1992, when in fact the photos had been originally labelled the year before. It also goes without saying that items of 3 of the victims' belongings were also found in Wally and Richard's homes. With the exception of Boris, the rest of the Milat family have either remained silent over Ivan's conviction or have come out in his defence, believing him to be wrongly convicted. Boris, however, has gone on record to say that he doesn't believe that Richard and Wally were involved in any way. Whether or not Ivan acted alone, only time will tell. However, the general consensus in Australia appears to be that now Ivan is no longer wasting oxygen. People can sleep a little easier at night. Sadly though, murder seems to run in the Milat family, as in 2010, Ivan Milat's great-nephew, Matthew Milat, was convicted on the 7th of June 2012 for the murder of his childhood friend, David Orgtoloni. Matthew had lured David out into the Belango State Forest alongside accomplice Cohen Klein, where he proceeded to strike him repeatedly with a medieval double-bladed axe. Reportedly, Matthew had been openly gloating about the killing the very next day. He was sentenced to 43 years behind bars. Thank you for watching. Be sure to check out my chat with Proper Horror Show over on her channel, where we look at Wolf Creek and how the events in the movie compared to the true story. You'll find links to her channel in the description and as a pinned comment. I highly recommend checking her out. I've also recently set up a Patreon account that you can join if you'd like to support the channel further. Patreons will receive the same access that channel members do, such as exclusive content and shoutouts at the end of each video. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank the following people for their continued support: Needle and Fur, The Alabastard, Mr. Gently Benevolent, and Amanda. Until next time, take care, and goodbye. For now.